So let's take a quick look at the characteristics of color. Now, depending on which book you've read or which instructor you've worked with, you may have heard one of two things: that there are 3 characteristics of color, or that there are 4. We're going to go through, no matter whether there are actually 3 or 4, there are actually 4 different things that you can measure when you're working with color, that you can see differences in, and that you can change and manipulate when you're painting. So we're going to talk about all 4 of those here. I've got some swatches of color actually painted on this piece of watercolor paper. I'm going to refer to those as I talk about each one of these different characteristics of color. For me, there are 4, and I'll talk about why I think there are 4 when we actually get through the list. The first one to know really is the hue. So when you talk about the hue of a color, you're really just talking about its name. So for instance, up here under this label hue, I've got a yellow square, a red square, and a blue square. So the hue is really just the name that you know and are familiar with and have learned from a very young age and are still using today. So you still need to know the name of them. If you're referring to, I need a yellow for this or a red for that, you certainly want to know that you're kind of at least in the category that you're working with. So that's hue, and again, very simple, very easy to figure out. The next one is value. Now, value really is a measure of the lightness or the darkness of the color. The reason this is important is that value is really very important in painting, and the value structure, as you probably have seen in some of the other videos here on watercolor methods, is very important, and maybe, in fact, I would say is more important really than the colors that are used in the painting itself. So it's important to understand when you've defined what values you intend to use in your painting, it's important to understand how to get those values in the colors that you're going to use in the painting as well. So I have a yellow and a red and a blue. They're actually different than the yellow and the red and the blue that are above under my heading of hue. The other thing I've added actually to these swatches is down below each, I've added a little swatch of gray. And I've done that so that you can see the relative value of each one of these. This yellow is actually a very light color. The red is sort of a light mid-value. And the blue is actually a fairly dark color. Now, one of the ways you can do that is you can lay out swatches of your colors and then try to match the value that you're getting in the color when you are looking at it by painting a swatch, or you can use a value scale. You can hopefully have a value scale like this that you have handy and you use it when you're painting. If you don't, you can actually, there's a video about creating this particular one, this very abbreviated 5-step one, right here on Watercolor Methods. You can click that link, there's a button down below, and create this if you like. But I'm going to use this just to illustrate my point. If I lay my value scale with my lightest gray over my yellow, you can see that that yellow sort of matches right up value-wise, as does this gray swatch that I've got down here. It looks like my gray swatch is actually a little bit lighter than that step of scale. Now, if I go to the red swatch, I'll go to this middle value, and you can see that the red is a little bit lighter than that, and yet it's actually darker than this gray. And again, on this abbreviated scale, sometimes we have to realize that we're looking we might not be matching the value exactly, but we know that it's somewhere between this and this, for instance, and that's where the red is. And you can see the swatch that I have down below, my little swatch of red. If I put my lightest value over, you can see it's a bit darker. And yet if I put my middle gray over it, it's actually a bit lighter. So it matches up, this swatch actually matches up that red in terms of value pretty well. And then finally I'll do the same thing with my blue. You can see it's very dark. It's actually darker than this dark gray swatch on my value scale, but it is lighter than the black. So again, its value lies somewhere between these two. And the swatch of gray that I have down below it, let's see if that is the same. And it is. It's certainly darker than the dark gray swatch I have on my 5-step scale, and it's somewhat lighter than my black that I have on my 5-step scale. One of the difficult things about actually moving from value, if you do a value sketch before you're painting, one of the difficult things about moving from value to color is that a couple of the other characteristics of color, one in particular that we're going to get to next, can confuse your eye and make you believe you're looking at something, in the case of this fairly bright yellow, something that's actually darker than it is. That color, if you look at it by itself without its swatch, you can see it kind of looks, it's bright, but it's also makes our eye think it's dark, and yet it's not. It's really this value, as I showed you when I used my value scale with it. So that actually leads us into the next characteristic that we're going to talk about, which is something called chroma. Now you'll see it worded that way in books often. Sometimes you hear it from an instructor, and it's a measurement that actually has a fairly complex set of characteristics surrounding it, but you can really just sort of simplify what it means by thinking in terms of brightness and dullness. So is the color bright or is it dull? Now that's not, technically that's really an equivalent way of describing chroma. It's not really exactly the way to describe chroma. I won't get into the ways in which it can be different, or you'll find variations in that. But for purposes of painting, really you want to know if you've got bright colors or dull colors, and if you're trying to use a bright color in a particular area and a dull color in another area, and how those two differences, the brightness or the dullness, will reveal things like light and form and shade and shadow for you. That's really the thing that you want to know when you're painting. And if you take a look at this, I actually have 5 colors down here. And you can see that several of them are actually very bright. This is lemon yellow. It's actually the same yellow here, but it's this version, this swatch of colors, actually even brighter than that one. You can probably see that on the video. This is Cadmium Red Light, and it's actually the same color as that, but you can see that it's actually brighter. It's got more intensity, which is another way to say chroma. It's got more intensity than this version of Cadmium Red does. And then over here at the end, this is Phthalo Blue. This Phthalo Blue is actually an extremely intense color, very bright. And here it's a bright color. It's actually the same color as this, although here I've added additional saturation. This is actually a more intense version, but because it's dark, we don't see the color quite as well. Here, where I've lightened it a little bit, you can actually see the intensity of it a little bit better. What I've done with each of these, which are colors right off the palette, nothing has been added to them. They came right off the palette, a little bit of water to keep them pretty intense, with a lot of chroma, that is, very bright, or as bright as I can get them with adding water to them. And there's nothing else in it except for the color and a little bit of water. What I've done down below is created another swatch actually of that same color, and I've added something to it which makes it dull. It dulls it down, so the color then loses intensity and in fact loses chroma. It's not as bright as these versions above. I've done something different to each one of those, and in future videos we'll actually take a look at how to make a color less intense or have lower chroma when you're working with it on your painting. But that's what I've done here. So basically think of, again, of chroma as the relative brightness or dullness of the color that you're working with. And the last characteristic that we're going to talk about, and again, some instructors will say this is not one of the characteristics of color, but is something separate, and other instructors will tell you that temperature is one of the 4 characteristics of color, and I tend to look at it that way myself, because temperature is one of those things that you can use to your advantage in a painting. You can change the temperature of a color by modifying it, by adding something to it like I did here. And you can also place colors next to each other in a painting so that one will show as, let's say, very warm and the other as very cool. And those contrasts actually help your painting in a number of ways by actually drawing the eye or leading the eye or not, actually, depending on how you use them. So it's a very useful characteristic that you can actually manipulate in your painting. I don't have any swatches of color down here because really I've illustrated temperature here. It's easy to think of in terms of just absolute warm and cool. It's easy to think of that by looking at this set of 4 colors. It's pretty clear that these colors to the left, the yellow, the red, the two reds, this is actually a red-orange, and this is kind of a red-violet color. But those three certainly look warmer than these two blues. And in general terms, that's the way temperature works. The greens, blues, and violets tend to be cool colors, and the warmer colors, yellows, oranges, and reds, tend to be warm colors. And that's, in sort of absolute terms, that's true. However, again, in future videos, as we explore this a little bit more, you'll see that actually putting certain, let's say, warm colors together will show that some of those colors are warmer, or we'll perceive that some of those colors are warmer, and some of those other colors are actually cooler. And the same with blues. You can, if you use them together properly and in proper contrast, you'll be able to see the difference temperature-wise between certain colors in your painting. So those are the four, in my book, the four characteristics of color that you really need to understand and get a handle on as you're learning to paint. Again, hue, which is the name of the color; value, which is essentially the relative lightness or darkness of the color; chroma, which again you can think of in simple terms just as being the relative brightness or dullness of the color; and the temperature, the perceptive quality of a color that makes it appear to be cold or cool or warm in a painting as you're using it. So that's it. Those are the four characteristics of color. And again, in future videos you'll be seeing more and more about these characteristics as we explore how to judge them and frankly how to use them in your paintings.